looks like. So all of the rest of our co-panelists. Wish we had like mannequins with like video robots.
Okay, welcome back, everybody, to the last two sessions of the day. We are going to get started with the afternoon session on filling evidence gaps and advancing learning on social cohesion. And I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping rules before we dive in. The first is just a reminder that this meeting is recorded, and so that's so we can share this out with people who were unable to attend. If you are joining us online, please remember to mute yourself if you're not speaking. And we are going to do our best to facilitate as much interaction as possible and cover all of your questions. And so please, if you're online, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And if you're in the room, you can raise your hand at the end. We're also going to ask if those online would like to vocalize your question. I'll be chatting with you during the session, and so we can come to you. And for all of the panelists who are here and joining us remotely, this is also a friendly reminder just to stay on camera. And that way we can easily toggle over to you. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Sheely, who will be facilitating this next session. Go ahead.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. As you guys remember, I'm Ryan Sheely. I'm the Director of Research in Conflict and Governance at Mercy Corps. I'm the 11th hour facilitator switch for this panel. Julie Werble from USAID was unable to make it, sends her regrets. But I'm really thrilled to be on this panel. And what we're going to be doing today in this session is a roundtable discussion focusing on identifying remaining evidence gaps. So much of today has been saying what we know, how we know it, and now is our chance to blue sky about what we don't know, what we wish we knew, and what we're excited about learning as a group. And we have an excellent panel of practitioners, researchers from a variety of sectors and organizations. We have with me in person Ali Rahim from the World Bank, who is the program manager for the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. And online we have Caitlin Sturridge, who's a senior research fellow from ODI, Claudine Kuradusenge-McLeod, who is a professorial lecturer and chair of the Ethics, Peace, and Human Rights MA program at the School of International Service at American University. Yulia Leininger, who's the head of programming for the Transformation of Political Disorder program at IDOS, formerly DIE. Mareike, who's a vice president for Busara Center of Behavioral Economics, who is on the screen here in the virtual room. And I believe we have Salma Mousa, assistant professor of political science at Yale. I hadn't seen Salma in the chat right before we chatted. But it's a great panel, as with the last session. Our panelists are going to start off with a brief 3-minute introduction that's really focusing on any one of these three questions or all of them, which is, where do we see that the evidence base is solid? So what do we think we know? But then especially, where are the gaps? What don't we know? What are you excited about learning more about? And then if you've started to answer some of these questions and you teed yourself up with a evidence gap that you're in the process of filling, tell us a little bit about what innovations or research you might be undertaking. So we'll then from there try to facilitate an open and roundtable discussion amongst the panelists and the whole audience members in DC and virtual. And Lisa will be helping out a lot with keeping that queue and keeping a good flow of operations and interventions. So it should be really fun and really looking forward to it. So to kick us off, Ali, over to you for your initial salvo.
Great, Ryan. Didn't know I was going first. I was trying to structure my thoughts, so please excuse if it's a bit of a stream of consciousness here. But so let me start with sort of, my engagement with this work. So I spent most of my career on the intersection of conflict and development. And one of the things, I'm doing broader things right now, but one of the things I've realized is how all these boundaries collapse. And we're looking at the social dimensions of development, and we try to parcel this into different areas. And the convergence of a lot of these data points, metrics, evaluation approaches for looking at social aspects in development are sort of coming really up to the fore right now, especially in the work I'm doing now. But going back about 6-7 years ago, initiated some work working with the Aga Khan Foundation, CIPRI, and the Center for Global Pluralism in Canada to look at social cohesion through an operational research program in a community development project context. So we did this work in Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan had just had a conflict in the southern region in the Osh Oblast, and we wanted to use that to sort of test an operational research methodology in ongoing community development programs. And so it was done over a 3-4 year period. I initiated the work, was on it for about a year or two, and then it went through several leaders in the bank as we all changed roles. But when we did that work, sort of we were aiming to develop a robust social cohesion index that could be applied in practice in a community development project. And, there were interesting insights. I went back to that work to, I haven't looked at it for many years, today and yesterday, and seeing, where we left it. And the findings there, I think, are still relevant today, is that, you need a type of systems level thinking for the kind of factors we look at, especially if you're thinking about how to influence development programs. So the linear model we think of in M&E or in even the other kinds of econometric analysis we do doesn't quite figure well in these. That's why we wanted an index one, because there's so many variables. So that sort of leads us to some of the thinking we're trying to unpack today. So I'm part of the social sustainability and inclusion global practice, and I'm the global lead for citizen engagement, social accountability, and lead this global program. And with our data team as well, we're trying to think of new ways to look at the kind of variables that matter for cohesion, that matter for social trust, that matter for participation and citizen engagement. And what we're realizing is we need new models and approaches beyond the traditional M&E we've had in bank projects. So thinking of frontier thinking and some of the moonshots we're going for, because I think that might be interesting for the group, we're finding there's a lot of interesting potential in new AI and ML models that ingest various forms of data, social media data, search data, even in low bandwidth environments, can ingest radio information, newsprint, and then also overlay that with all kinds of different development data, GIS data, and we start to see an interplay of factors that we can't really unpack from our traditional analytic approaches. So that's one model. We're working with sort of a path-breaking AI/ML firm called Poloria, which has sort of made some of the biggest strides in looking at complex social phenomenon and having very high degree of predictive accuracy for things like outcomes like conflict, population movements. And we have operational pilots in a number of World Bank projects, and we're thinking of how we kind of use this kind of new research to then be very practical, very operational, things that can inform the World Bank in planning, can inform our clients in planning. So I think the real step change has to come from a new relationship with data and actually making social dynamics part of the data dialogue in organizations like the bank, where it's always been seen as a nice to have, but really hasn't been taken seriously as a form of systematic evidence. And so that's what our practice is working on. And Nick might have touched on some of this when he was here, but really this applies to a broad range of interventions, and sort of it's a new area of work we're really trying to push into.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. I look forward to hearing more and digging in. Up next, we have our initial intervention from Caitlin Sturridge. Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everyone. So I am Caitlin Sturridge. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. And I'm going to base my intervention around a relatively new piece of research that we are working on that looks at social cohesion, specifically in context of displacement, and in particular between refugees and hosts, but also looking at groups, at social cohesion within groups of refugees. So it's a 2-year research project. We've published so far a kind of analytical think piece, and we have 3 country case studies coming up. One which is nearly complete in Pakistan, another which we're hoping to start in Tanzania, and a third one that will be looking at a context involving Syrian refugees. So what I'm going to talk to you today about, my rapid intervention around some of these gaps, is really building on some of that theoretical and analytical work. It's not actually substantiated by any research that we've done yet, but we're looking to dig into some of these issues in the case studies that we'll be working on. So the key evidence gap is this idea that the risks, limitations, and trade-offs of social cohesion and displacement are not well understood. So this is getting away from some of the rhetoric and the narrative around social cohesion as being inherently a good thing. I should probably say right now that this intervention is a bit provocative, and it's intended to be so. I've only got 3 minutes, so I can't nuance a lot of what I'm saying. But if you refer to our paper, and I'll post that in the chat in a minute, there's a lot more contextualization and nuance in that. But generally speaking, many social processes are typically framed within a positive framing. So social cohesion, for example, is often seen as a positive foundation for development, growth, peace building, and conflict resolution. And this arguably overlooks some of the risks, limitations, and inconsistencies that are embedded in all social processes, so not just social cohesion. So I'm going to focus on 3 risks and limitations that emerged in our think piece, but there are more in there as well. So the first risk is around the unintended effects of aid on social cohesion. The idea that aid can often have unintended consequences. These can be both positive and negative, by the way, on social relations. And this is especially the case when it comes to looking at social cohesion in relation to refugees and hosts. But in spite of this, we still don't really have a clear enough understanding about the relationship between aid and cohesion, and more research is still needed on this topic, as well as more monitoring and evaluation embedded in social cohesion projects. Studies that we've been reviewing show that the kind of aid that is given, how it is distributed, and to whom can all have a bearing on the wider dynamics of social cohesion. So the second risk that I want to talk about is around national unity and assimilation. It's worth pointing out now that socially cohesive societies do not have to live in perfect harmony, rather that social cohesion is about managing difference and tensions so that these do not spill into conflict. So within this definition, within this kind of framing, social cohesion in and of itself is not about national unity and assimilation. But risks arise when aspects of social cohesion are co-opted, for example, by political projects designed to build unity at the expense of diversity and pluralism. And what would seem like fairly benign qualities that are embedded within social cohesion, so qualities such as togetherness, collectivity, community, and belonging, a shared sense of identity, these can and have been exploited or used by dominant groups to mobilize conflict against others. Just one more minute. Okay. The third risk that I want to talk about is around the legal implications and limitations of social cohesion. And this is really in relation to displacement settings and refugees. So social cohesion doesn't provide a pathway to citizenship for refugees, nor is it a durable solution. And it does not address questions around legal rights, status, and access to services, in contrast to wider processes such as integration or inclusion. And arguably, by sidestepping these legal implications, social cohesion can become something of a halfway house, leaving refugees in a legal limbo. And this is problematic for obvious reasons from a rights and legal perspective. So I'll leave it there just to say that some of these kind of risks, limitations, and trade-offs, they are recognized, but they are often not recognized as well. And it's very easy, I think, to be drawn into the positives of social cohesion without fully taking into account the very real trade-offs that it implies, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable groups, and especially in contexts of displacement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Caitlin. And the provocations are welcome. And I think it's a good point. If we're going to advance knowledge and advance thinking, then being pushed even on the premises and assumptions is very welcome. So thanks very much. Next up, we have Claudine Kuradusenge-McLeod. Claudine, over to you.
Good afternoon. Like Caitlin, most of my work has been focusing on migration, but in my case, I've focused on diaspora communities. And the remarks I want to make are going to be based on two case studies. The first one is Ethiopians American here in the DMV, especially in Virginia. For those who've been following elections, especially the 2021 election, Virginia, Ethiopians mobilized and actually turned Virginia red. Over 50,000 of them came together as a protest vote against Democrats and against President Biden's agenda for Ethiopia. And they were like, no, we're not going to take it. We're just going to vote against the Democratic candidate at that time because it does not make sense how the US is dealing with Ethiopia. The second case is really kind of looking at what's been happening in Eastern Congo right now, where a lot of the diaspora communities in Europe and in the US, especially Rwandans, Burundian, and Congolese, have come together and create a campaign to first create awareness around what is happening there, but also trying to change the policy in the different countries they live in. And those two case studies have been extremely fascinating for me because both of them are showing us the power of diaspora, not in the homeland, but in the country they actually live in. Most of the work, especially scholarly work and research, has been focusing on how diaspora community impact their own countries, both politically, financially. But we don't necessarily have much on how diaspora communities create a power struggle within the country they actually reside. And in a lot of ways, that is tied to what diaspora communities are about. And in order to understand that, we kind of have to look at diaspora community through this idea of imagined communities and the subjectivity that comes with that. And that is really tied to three different ideas. The first one is really kind of what it means to be part of diaspora in the country they come from, especially for the conflict-based diaspora. The second one is that sense of loss when they left and how that sense of loss in a lot of ways has been transmitted through generations, through the different struggles they experience. And that is also tied to the third one, which are the stories and the different memories they are kind of promoting in their own communities, but also promoting around. So in that case, social cohesion really looks at two different things, both the positive aspect, but also the gap that comes with that. Social cohesion through political participation, voting, social mobilization has, in a lot of ways, seen how a lot of diaspora communities have created a macrocosm that is there for them, that has created a lot of really social bonding and attachments to their own groups, on reason, the level based on identities, on religion, a lot of different things. But we can see how diaspora communities have come together and create a home away from home. And they put together a lot of mechanisms, which has been kind of that positive aspect. The gaps then there are really tied to the idea of they also have brought the same tension, the same conflict in the country they actually reside, the host country. And that means that in a lot of ways, they have created this specific tension in the country they live in. And they have, in a lot of ways, like the two different cases, trying to influence the country they come from through a lot of political actions, a lot of voting actions, and a lot of mechanisms that in some ways have helped them feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves, but also have helped in a lot of ways destabilize both the country they are from and the country they actually live in. So a lot of the evidence we have, a lot of the ideas we have comes from the understanding of who the diaspora communities are in terms of country they come from. But we don't necessarily have much when it comes to how they are a big players in the country they currently reside on. And in times where migration, refugees, climate change, and conflict are kind of the main pressing issues we're facing with now, diaspora are becoming more and more influential. And the question is, what does that mean, especially in terms of social cohesion? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudine, and for drawing these attentions to transnational dynamics. And I think that it's so diaspora communities and the transnational aspects of social cohesion are really under-discussed today. In fact, because we are such a operational and program-focused discussion in this conference, a lot of those programs have geographic boundaries in one country, one community. And so really highlighting some of the ways in which these dynamics and challenges around social cohesion are crossing boundaries is really, really useful and boundary pushing. Next up, we have Julia Leininger. Julia, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll start with a very short intro to our project on social cohesion, and then I would like to focus on one particular gap in research and then say in very concrete terms what we do to contribute to fill gaps in also creating knowledge in development cooperation. So our project looks at what influences social cohesion, and we look at social policies, values, we look at conflict, at urbanization, taxation, inequality. It's a project with 11 researchers, so there's a lot in it, and I hope that during our subsequent discussion I can bring in some of the knowledge that we generated or are generating in the project. And we are also starting another one on mobility and migration and social cohesion, which starts next year. But the gap, I'd like to kind of zoom out a bit. I mean, you did that already, Claudine, with looking at the transnational relations, but I'd like to look at political systems, and it is kind of an implicit assumption that social cohesion, where it works, requires tolerance, which allows different individuals and groups to respect each other, right? Identity and belonging is strong, but a strong factor in social cohesion, but it only works if different identities are respected in one society. And that brings me to another implicit assumption that actually I gave a talk last week at the UN conference of the human rights.
Lisa, can you tell? The whole Zoom session ended. Yeah, maybe done. Now it's just you and me. Know any good jokes about social cohesion? We need your playlist. Yeah, this is true. A tech hiccup was inevitable. It's amazing we lasted this long, to be honest. I'm responding to frantic emails from the entire panel. Okay, yeah, me too. we can at least get them up and running for the room.
But I don't know how to project. Oh, it's a different Zoom link. Yeah, like we could just make a new Zoom link and send it to the panel and get that.
Yeah, I guess the computer here would have to go to the computer here as well. They could log in and then it would get projected. Sorry, so that means we're not getting back. Yep. All right, everybody. We are going to keep improvising here. We are now going full fireside chat with me and Ali. Like literally, the fire is the Zoom account, and we are doing that. But I'm going to, while our colleagues tirelessly try to reestablish and bring back the rest of our panel, I wanted to ask you, Ali. So you mentioned some of this innovative use of machine learning that you've been working on. Can you say more about some of the programs where you've been using that and some of the practical applications?
Sure. So we've piloted this in the Horn of Africa, and there's potential forthcoming work in Europe and Central Asia. Can't identify the country yet. We also are looking at this in DRC, Eastern DRC. So there's also a high conflict context where this is relevant, though this isn't restricted to conflict context. And so basically, I mean, it's not pertaining only to social cohesion, but it looks at trust as variables. A lot of the elements that you look at in cohesion. And the interesting thing about this kind of, so the model, you know, obviously has complex algorithms, but the algorithms are trained by also experts who are anthropologists, political scientists. So it's taking into account a lot of the theoretical knowledge and then building country-based models. So it's these models are individually tailored to country context, dynamics. And so you can query the model for all sorts of things. Let's say you're seeing mounting social protest in an X geography. You know, if you do an analog or traditional research analysis, you know, you can apply all series of, you know, explanatory thinking about what's going on. But this model may tell you, your instinct may be, well, okay, it's about regressive fuel subsidies and people are protesting. And then the model can actually tell you, well, no, sure, that's there. But what this is really about is endemic corruption in local municipal officials. You know, so it's sort of allowing you to surface issues that then are very operationally relevant for a place like the World Bank.
And this is primarily social listening based on social media data, or what are the inputs that go in?
Inputs are social media data. You can do it's newspapers. It can use radio if you do voice to text, and then it's looking at you know, different data sources of the actual incidence of unrest. Like it uses ACLED data for conflict. But then, you know, you can have the model ingest all sorts of data that's available in the country context.
That's really amazing. I want to kind of open up to the room, as much as the room is still with us, of, you know, we've lost most of our panelists. We don't see them yet. So I guess to ask all of you, what evidence gaps are you excited about in this space? As you were listening to the first, I don't know, 3.5 panelists, what sprang to mind for you? And let's just kind of keep this open to the room. I saw Jessica's hand go up. Go for it, Jessica. We are vamping in real time together, so.
I'm giving, oh, excellent, this works. Well, one of our speakers brought up an interesting concept on social cohesion in the United States. And I was just wondering who is working on this in this room, or who's exploring this, or even this great tool that Ali is talking about, which I know the World Bank doesn't apply to the US, but you know, what are we seeing in terms of those applications across both developing as well as developed, global north, global south, different things like that?
It's a great question. I was having the same answer. I don't know, Lisa, would you be willing to speak a little bit about urban-rural action? Because I think it's a really interesting case study of what some of this may look like in a US context.
Yeah, it is a good question, and I don't have a lot of answers because it does feel like it's so emerging in the U.S. But I volunteer as a board member on the organization Urban Rural Action, which was founded by a former Mercy Corps member, peace building team member, who is applying a lot of our international approaches to the U.S. And I was reflecting on this question about the concepts of localization apply to U.S. peace building, and the idea of creating, shared indicators. And one challenge we are having at UR Action is simply, it's two steps before that of creating consensus that social cohesion is in fact a worthy goal, and that it is something that we should be working toward. If you're really looking at people across the ideological spectrum, that it is part of democracy, and that democracy is important. And so I feel in some ways we are at the ideation, co-creation, localization stage of just trying to get buy-in, let alone sort of what specific type of cohesion and how do we go about it. And we use a lot of the same methods in terms of bringing people together around a shared, very local goal related to collective action. So.
There's an interesting thing to point out. I mean, it's a great question, and not necessarily related to conflict or distrust in the U.S., but there's been incredible work by Rod Chetty and his team looking at cohesion in capital, which a lot of you might be familiar with, and actually hasn't as systematically been translated to international development economics. But given the richness of U.S. census data and the ability to look at this over time, the importance of cohesion or social capital, I mean, it's coming out hugely. I mean, this work may win the Nobel Prize. And so that kind of evidence and bringing that type of approach to our work internationally, I mean, it's something we're trying to do in the bank, but these aren't the things traditionally we've really looked at as drivers of poverty. But this work in the U.S. could actually really change how we do development economics as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
As a quick response to that, so at Search for Common Ground, when was it, last year, we've launched the Common Ground USA. And it was really interesting, I think, for all of us at Search to sort of see how things that we have preached and practiced abroad, how they apply here in the US. And it was also interesting for me to observe things like when we talk about fragmentation, right, or polarization, or personal agency, right, institutional legitimacy, things that we're trying to capture and measure through the peace impact framework. How that also gets talked about in the US. So some of our colleagues who are part of the Common Ground USA initiative, they would say, oh, no, we can't put these people together in the same room, right? Because they just come from such polar ends of the, right, of the spectrum. And then we would sort of laugh at this ourselves, saying like, well, we've been trying to do this or pretending to do this globally, right? And assuming that it's fine to put all of these people together in the same room. So, for me, it was sort of like just a good indication that it's a litmus test, really, right? When we try to do these things domestically, and to see how that actually works. So, not maybe a perfect answer, but like I'm actually looking forward to seeing how this peace impact framework ends up working out in the US as well.
I think I saw another hand way back at the back table.
Yeah, it's kind of related to some of your responses, but inspired by Jessica's question. To what extent, so there's a lot of research, right, on polarization, fragmentation. I know measuring the opposite of a concept isn't like measuring the concept, right? But to what extent are there insights that we can get from research that has focused on polarization and fragmentation? And does that provide insight to how we think about social cohesion, in particular in the context of the US, but also more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great point. Do you get anything on fragmentation in the work that you've been doing on the social listening and machine learning, or I'm curious?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. I'm not doing the work myself. I don't have the data back.
You're not sitting there.
helping the team sort of systematize and build this platform. But, on that, I mean, I think, this issue of fragmentation, social trust, one other place we're trying to develop this and scale, in my day-to-day work, is on how we systematize citizen engagement approaches. And there too, we're trying to think on, so this is how to translating into the operational modalities for places like the bank, bilaterals, working with client governments, is, political trust clearly seems to be a prerequisite for volitional citizen participation, but are there types of design we can build in to development projects, into the policy dialogue in countries that addresses things like fragmentation, that addresses low levels of political trust? Effectively, are there things you can do to incentivize engagement and participation at scale? So that's actually a big thing we're doing right now. It's actually going to, our global director of SSI, this is part of what we're trying to take to the board of the World Bank very soon, hopefully by January. So we're trying to think of these things writ large. I mean, they're most acute in the conflict context, but really they matter across the spectrum.
What I hear in that is just a shift to both focusing on the vertical dimensions of cohesion. And that sounds like, I mean, my roots are in governance programming, and that's a big shift into governance, which is amazing. And that's very cool. I'm interested, not to do a hard segue, but if our conversation had been on track originally, I think I would have asked a question about kind of where we're seeing kind of interesting questions about this interplay between the vertical and horizontal dimensions of social cohesion. And I do think this fragmentation and the role that states and politicians and political parties can play in either stoking fragmentation or togetherness and common purpose is really fascinating. Interested, just kind of open back to the room. Other themes, topics, I mean, again, we are just freewheeling here. So for you guys, your organizations, what on these themes, whether it's on the interplay of the vertical and horizontal or anything else that sparked your curiosity, what are you all seeing as other evidence gaps or exciting areas? Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, this is probably more me personally than Mercy Corps, but I'd be curious if there's been any learning so far, or if it is a gap to maybe study social cohesion and social movements, or nonviolent action, which I think we typically think of as kind of adversarial, disruptive approaches, but I think we're learning a lot more about the integration of social movements and peace builders and how they're able to build, certainly within their own movements, huge, contingencies and consensus, and sort of, is there any study of that, maybe USIP or others who kind of look at that intersection, kind of how can we learn from that, and also maybe use these movements as an area to sort of incubate some of those ideas?
I know we have some USIP colleagues in the back. Has there been any learning about social cohesion in social movements, in nonviolent action? I think that's a fascinating area.
So I would say our NVA team, our nonviolent action team, is the team that works on that, but it's not my team. So I'll defer to David if there's any insights you would like to add.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, great question. Julie, I will follow up and get back to you. All I would say is that I would be optimistic because our NVA nonviolent action team has been committed to research for many years now and is constantly coming up with new research topics. So I would be optimistic that there is something there to feed back to that great question, but sorry, I don't have it right now. Thanks.
It is a fascinating thing where, and I was reflecting on this in some of the early interventions, especially thinking about some of what Claudine was sharing on work on diaspora communities of, there is so much implicit kind of boundaries that get drawn of like, well, this is roughly the study of social cohesion. And there's kind of a set of kind of research questions on intergroup interactions, on citizen-state interactions, but I think a question like this where it's like, oh yeah, the nonviolent movements people are not in the room, but it's absolutely relevant. The folks who do social policy, social programming in the US aren't in the room. And I do think there's this risk of making social cohesion everything and then as a result, nothing. But I do think that sparking this curiosity from other fields, kind of other sectors that get siloed away is super relevant, because I think that's where then I imagine that in some of the social movements work, I know there's great work by Erica Chenoweth at Harvard Kennedy School that is like really kind of drawing some of these lenses from study of conflict into study of nonviolent movement. So I do think there's this ability for really creative cross-learning and innovation. By body language, I infer that we still yet do not have a live Zoom link, as in addition by the
Yeah, we'll
coming.
give you an update in 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes. Okay. Nell, I saw your hand. Keep us going.
Sure, I'll do my best. It's not necessarily a novel input, but I had been thinking about, all of the potential to learn more about vertical social cohesion. And I think you're right, Ryan. It's partly a matter of looking at how do we understand the interplay of the horizontal and the vertical, but also when it comes to strengthening vertical social cohesion and when it comes to institutionalizing some of the practices that allow for inclusivity, participation, voice, equity, transparency. I mean, I think it would be an interesting question to look at sort of what are the preconditions for those kinds of changes to truly be sustained within institutions so that that vertical cohesion can endure over time. And so how much of that how much does that require a lot of work with the actual cohesion work with the actual human beings in those institutions, and how much of it is, has to be obviously embedded within policies and practices, but then how do you continually refresh that? What's the process to ensure the sustainability in vertical social cohesion would be, I think, an area worthy of more attention.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, from a policy perspective and from where we're trying to get at these at a place like the World Bank, I mean, that's, I don't know, the $50 billion question. But because we don't have robust evidence, it's very hard to make the case for systemic change for these kinds of things. Actually, that's one of the things in my role I need to do this year is go back to our board on our citizen engagement social accountability approach in the bank, which has become somewhat mechanistic and projectized because we can't make a good evidence-based case for how you integrate this more systematically into how we deliver programs. But that evidence base is where we want to go. And there is good evidence out there, but again, if you're going to say, let's have a systemic approach in an organization like this, and so, I think, that's it.
I think another piece of this is also going then from bits of evidence that are scattered back into theory building, right? And I know that in worlds of practice, theory feels like the opposite of practice, but I think especially when trying to think about systemic change and these bigger ripple effects, starting to take these scattered bits of evaluation, bits of even big data, and then start to feed them back into kind of our broader theories of change is a big piece of that. And some of what we've done at Mercy Corps is realize that, in some of our governance work and our vertical social cohesion work and in our horizontal intergroup social cohesion work, there's similar operating kind of main ingredients. And kind of it took actually much more qualitative theory building work to kind of figure that out. And then, so it's not just kind of pressing the button and kind of doing the same models over and over again, but allowing the theories of change and allowing the models to evolve over time that kind of links that theory and evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And, it takes me, we did an interesting review in our practice last week where our global data analytics lead did a paper on citizen engagement, political trust in Latin America. And instead of using like traditional linear regression models, used an ML decision tree model, looking at political trust and then the likelihood of an individual citizen to participate in a protest, sign a petition, and the third was get involved in community action to resolve an issue being faced in the community. And so while it was, the insight was quite interesting to then see what's generated about the likelihood of an individual person doing X, right? And then that kind of evidence in a place like the World Bank is much more compelling when we're trying to advise why this matters for actual concrete development outcomes. They didn't take into account in this model what was being influenced. So that's, I was a reviewer for that. I encourage, that would be very helpful for us to know. Does it make a difference if what was trying to be influenced was a, you know, let's say a World Bank infrastructure or an infrastructure investment or budget allocation or X, because that probably influences behavior. But these kinds of evidence models that combine this kind of rigorous data analytics with qualitative cases are the kind of things we need to actually build the case for systemic change. And there's openness to it, but we need a deeper evidence base.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. And thank you, everybody else, for helping us fill in. Welcome back to our Zoom panelists. What you have missed is that we basically did maybe the world's first freestyle panel facilitation. Right there. It's actually been fun. We kind of did it in reverse, but really glad to have all of you back. Do we have everyone back? I know like Yulia was cut off mid-sentence, so if she's back, I'd pass the mic to her. Failing that, she's not back, and I'm guessing Mareike is not back. Mareike just joined. So let's go this way. I know Salma has a time constraint. So Salma, we're going to go next to you. We'll go then to Mareike. And then if Yulia manages to rejoin, we'll go to her. So Salma, over to you. Welcome back to your opening remarks that are now like an hour into this, this panel.
To be here. So I was asked to think a little bit about what do we know about the evidence base on social cohesion, what we don't know, and what innovations do I think it would be useful for everyone here to know about. So I'll do my best to keep this really succinct. So what we know about social cohesion. So I think of cohesion as tolerance, trust between outgroups, and the shared identity. So that's just to preface this. So what we know, so I focus a lot on prejudice reduction, so that trust and tolerance part. So the evidence on intergroup contact as a way to reduce prejudice, generally pretty positive evidence base and quite rigorous. The evidence based on perspective taking, so when you're not able to get people face to face, but you're helping them think about what it's like to interact with the outgroup, put yourself in their shoes, that also tends to work. Like time and time again, those studies seem to work. In both cases, prejudice reduction tends to work through these emotional channels of inducing empathy, not really through cognitive intellectual channels. So that's those are the two strategies that I think they tend to work pretty well. Secondly, we also know that forced assimilation creates a backlash. So the multicultural approach just does better than the assimilation approach. Minorities tend to actually have a strong backlash where they turn more to their communities and become less willing to interact with outgroups when they're forced to assimilate. For example, headscarf bans in France, for example, language bans in the US, things like that. The caveat on all this is that most of our evidence comes from the West. It doesn't come from recent post-conflict settings. And in those recent post-conflict settings, the evidence on everything I just said is a lot more mixed. When it works in a much more limited way. And especially with things like contact, there's a higher risk of re-triggering war traumas, which is obviously not great. So there's potentially a trade-off here where when the conflict is salient and you get people together to discuss it, there's a PTSD aspect, but people also become more forgiving. Recording in progress. Okay, what we don't know yet, the durability of these results. By durability, I don't just mean short-term or long-term. I mean, are they resilient? Can they withstand shocks to tolerance when there's like an ethnic entrepreneur or political entrepreneur who comes to try to shake things up in a negative way? What else we don't know? On measurement, we don't have a lot of measurement of real-world behaviors when it comes to social cohesion. So what does it mean to be in a cohesive society? Like, how do you know that you're in one? How do you know you're in a place with a strong sense of community or a bad sense or a low sense of community? That you're in a place that trusts outgroups or doesn't trust outgroups? Like, we need to move away from lab games, move away from surveys that capture beliefs, and start thinking more like, if we have what is the behavioral change we want to see with these interventions? When people walk away months later and they're dealing with strangers from the outgroup, what are the behaviors we want to change? The end game, right? What else we don't know? We tend to focus on interventions that focus on prejudice, which makes sense. But we don't look a lot at economic interventions and the potential social outcomes related to that. So things like livelihoods programming, cash transfers, does that have an effect on social cohesion if people aren't worrying about those economic grievances that sometimes drive real intergroup conflict? What else we don't know? How to create an inclusive national identity without making the world very bland. That's something else that's like an open question to me. And finally, as in-group identity increases, so you're building more social cohesion, bringing more people into your in-group, which is a good thing, is that at the expense of hating some out-group more? So is that a necessary thing that we have to accept? Like, okay, we're going to increase national identity, bring more people into the fold, but now we hate all our common enemies more. And is that necessarily better? Finally, what innovations do I want to bring people's attention to? So I'm working with USAID in Mali and my colleagues Dan Posner and Chad Hazlett at UCLA. We are randomizing villages to receive either like a dispute resolution intervention, so your classic like social institution trust building intervention, versus an economic intervention, so an unconditional cash transfer. And we're trying to pit these two approaches directly against each other, the trust building and the economic, and test their impact on social outcomes and prejudice and trust outcomes. And I think this is kind of low-hanging fruit. All this development programming, why don't we have those social things like prejudice as key outcomes? Secondly, attitudes don't always lead to behavioral change. Like we have this as our theory of change, like change attitudes first, that's easy, and then maybe we can change behaviors. I don't really think it's that linear. Sometimes behaviors are actually easier to change and people hold on their prejudice belief and that changes in the longer term. So I just think that's something that's open. Finally, social trust looks very different in a lab versus in the real world. And it doesn't mean that the lab version or survey versions of measuring trust are wrong. It's just a different component of trust. So for example, with Saad Guzar at Princeton, we have a project where in 7 or 8 different countries around the world, we have Confederates go out and ask people for help. Can you help me? My cell phone is dead. Can you help me find this place? Asking for directions. Someone drops a bag of groceries and see who helps them. And what we see is that some groups that in lab games and in surveys are the most pro-social and the most trusting, for example, women or ethnic minorities, when you look in the real world, they are the least trusting. Because in the real world, we have safety considerations, we have regressive social norms that prohibit women from participating in the public space, for example. And so what we're seeing is like totally different sets of results. And so that suggests that social cohesion and a sense of community as we experience it in our day-to-day lives is a very different thing from social cohesion that we measure in surveys, which is more related to political preferences, for example. So that's kind of a really, like, that's what was kind of a whirlwind crash course and everything I've learned over the past few years. And I'm looking forward to others' feedback and thoughts.
Thanks so much, Salma. And there's a lot there to dig into. I think one reflection, now that we're totally in like informal mode, when you mentioned, that the risks of in creating social cohesion between one set of groups, you create a new outgroup. For whatever reason, I think of the 90s film Independence Day, in which the only thing that created unity and social cohesion among all humans was an alien invasion. And so, but then I guess that we'd have to start building social cohesion with intergalactically as well. But no, really rich and really great stuff. Yulia, let's go back to you. You were mid-sentence when Zoom detonated. So you can feel free to restart your remarks and dive right in. But thank you. I'm so glad you were able to make it back.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, and like I tested again whether there's a causality, but I said United Nations or UN, and the World Bank system failed. I don't know.
Well, that's a rigorous identification strategy. Yeah, exactly. Only some kinds of multilateralism are welcome here.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I'd love to speak directly to some of the points of Salma and share some observations, but let's do that. Maybe we still have some time afterwards. But I wanted to talk about one gap only, but now when I heard the others talking, I thought that it's maybe important, and that was stressed in one of the previous sessions as well, to talk about one really, really important finding, because we're talking now on community level, projects, effects of projects, people, behavior, attitudes, etc. So it is important to be actor-centered, but what we know from different evidence gap maps is that social cohesion measures or projects only seem to work on the long run if structural factors also change. So inequality, for instance, has to be tackled, social issues, etc. So I think we have to think much broader in development cooperation and development research. I know that's difficult because everybody's into his or her own research question, into the project and the log frames and whatsoever, and the theory of change, and that's important. But I do think in order to foster social cohesion, we have to see the bigger picture here and connect different development interventions as well. And I think, Salma, you spoke to that when you also said you look at economics and at other behavioral issues. That leads me to my second point, which I conceive as one of the big gaps in this research. And that's something that we tackle in our project as well, and we will do more research on that. And that's that we know very little about the patterns of political institutions that enable social cohesion. We all agree that the vertical dimension, the relationship between the people and the state or another subordinate unit, is crucial for social cohesion. But we know very little. It seems kind of evident that participatory institutions that enable trust, institutions people can trust in, institutions that make people participate, that are accountable, that acknowledge different identities are important for social cohesion. But we don't know a lot about the patterns. And why is this especially important in our world today? We live in a world where the majority of people live in autocracies, more than 70% of the world population, and autocratization is going on. So what does social cohesion have to do with autocratization? Autocrats use polarization as one of their main means to autocratize societies. And these polarizing and nationalist politics do not only destroy social cohesion, they also disable development cooperation. For instance, if you look at nationalist governments, they reduce development aid, etc. So I do think the interaction between public administration, between political institutions and people is really, really crucial, and we need to understand that better in the world of today. So what do we do about this, and how do we contribute to bring evidence together? And there are three things I'd like to mention. The first one, and some of you in the room are aware of that, we together with the World Bank have a social cohesion series that takes place 3 to 4 years times a year, and I invite you to contribute to that. It has been great discussions to kind of build a community here and help to build that community. The second, and you can see that here in the back, is the Social Cohesion Hub. That is a platform that is neutral. Our logo is not on that. It's a common good for everybody to participate, because we conceive that, I mean, when we started this 3 years ago, we didn't have conferences like this one where we bring people together, but we would really like to encourage all of us to share our data, the literature, the projects, etc. on the hub, and to create a platform where people can learn about social cohesion from different parts of society. And let me leave it at that. given the time constraints that have increased now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, Mareike, we're over to you. Thanks for staying patient and for making it back.
No problem. Who knew Zoom could still surprise us? But I do want to give a shout out to the person who to me is the real hero of gap filling. Donovan O'Neill Mackenzie conjured up a new Zoom link. So fantastic job. Thank you so much. So I want to make 2 points and build on remarks, not just those that my colleagues just made, but actually from previous sessions, from 2 sessions ago. So of course, there's a huge, very solid evidence base on many aspects of this, but I see room for looking at evidence that is needed to support what I think are 2 really crucial reframings of social cohesions. And this, what I'm going to talk about, is really based on 10 years of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium at ODI, of which I was the last research director. And what I think they offer is also a shift in the discourses and narratives that had been referred to earlier. And maybe, Ryan, I don't know, maybe they even make us aware of the fact that international engagement in some of the contexts that I'm going to be talking about can feel a little bit like that alien invasion that you referenced, because it really can be quite alienating in the true sense of the word. On vertical social cohesion, and one is on, I guess, nuance and the layers of experience that make up the elements that maybe become someone's ability to live cohesively. So there's a lot of question marks attached to this. So one of the earlier speakers said that social cohesion, of course, changes over time, and we don't really know enough about what triggers these changes. One way to think about is vertical social cohesion. So what holds things together in this often extremely fraught state-society relationship? I mean, Julia just pointed towards this, which is not even often a state-society relationship. There isn't necessarily a state. There is maybe an administrative authority, and there certainly isn't necessarily a society, but we still try to look at it through that lens. And maybe that's part of the alien invasion. But that relationship is often, continues to be imagined as quite rule-based and quite transactional in a kind of broad international imagination. And the shorthand for that continues to be the service delivery paradigm, that the state delivers services. So in order for citizens to repay that with an appreciation of legitimacy and then leading to less contestation. But of course, that's not really how it works. We tried very hard to establish that empirically, and we couldn't. And instead, what the SLRC proposes is to reframe this negotiation of the relationship as what we call the salient issues. And what that means is that you look at what are the lines along which this relationship between state and society, or whatever manifestations of those 2 you have, is negotiated, and by whom is it negotiated, under which circumstances. And so that means to start with the question, what matters to people and why does it matter? We already have some more evidence already, for example, that education matters a lot in Sri Lanka, but other services do not matter so much for this relationship. Land rights matter a lot in Pakistan. Why does the experience in the process of receiving a health service seem to matter a lot more for how people experience the relationship to the state in Nepal than the access service? We didn't see that access really matter very much. And so how can these insights of what are the crucial issues, the salient issues along the lines of which people understand this vertical social cohesion, what are the salient issues along the lines of which they negotiate this? And how can these insights maybe help us to unpack the concept of social cohesion and why it changes? And I think that unpacking would also give a really different angle to governments, because if governments picked salience over what is the easiest to deliver and measure, which is what often happens right now, then it's a really open question to me of what that would look like for this negotiated relationship. And it might also be an added angle to something we spoke earlier about, to participatory indicators, because it's very interesting to ask, how do you track the salience of an issue to people? Part 2 is also came up throughout the day. What part of identity are we actually looking at when we're looking at identity underpinning social cohesion? And who decides that identity? Paola was talking about this earlier. Identity is, of course, a really fickle thing, and it is often used synonymously with a category, right? With youth, women, vulnerable, all these categories that everyone uses very fluently, and where categorization becomes almost like a kind of artificial glue around an idea of cohesion that kind of projects as if there's something combining groups of people. But of course, categories based on identity are extremely disruptive because they project this cohesion by drawing a border around a group of people, calling them cohesive, and then doing something really unhelpful, which is then calling on them to change their identity, because programs that offer something based on a group that has been identified based on their identity then usually ask people to change that identity. You're a vulnerable woman, please be empowered. You're a teenage girl, please act differently. So it becomes very volatile, and it's very difficult to then link that up to how this is supposed to create a more cohesive experience for people. And of course, also identities are fickle because everyone holds multiple identities. That came up earlier as well. That we know. I think what's a less clearly articulated issue is that people can also hold very different community and individual identities. So an individual experience of violence, for example, tends to be often equated with a community experience. But of course, people hold community and individual experience in very, very different ways. So the personal experience is often kind of neglected, overlooked for the sense of understanding what the community experience is. And Pamina said earlier that conflict experience can be very different on the local level, but of course the local level already is one of those imaginations of cohesion that isn't really very complete because there's a lot hidden behind that. And so what I would propose to do is that it helps us to think of a concept that I call the mental landscape, which is kind of a representation of the very many layers of memories and of decisions and of sense-making and the stories that people tell themselves why a situation is the way it is, one's chosen community identity and personal identity, and how this mental landscape then shapes the willingness to engage in a maybe socially coherent environment. But I will end by this saying that while I think this is a helpful, interesting concept, it really needs a lot of refining and unpacking and operationalizing. So there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mareike. And I think on this point on kind of unpacking, refining, and operationalizing, I'd love to put a question back to the whole panel of, it strikes me that a number of our exciting directions are very meta level, right? Or zooming out. We've zoomed out 5 or 6 times, which I think is actually, actually a relevant tactic for a panel that's talking about evidence gaps. But I'd love to hear, I think maybe starting with Caitlin, going back to some of the critical perspectives on social cohesion, what that means and kind of what some of the recommendations you have for what that means for programming and an approach. But I think that question of kind of what that operational upshot is, I think maybe I would love to hear Claudine kind of hear some of those operational or kind of policy upshots from your research as well. So I think I'd love to kind of do a round with the panel of kind of that operationalizing your research, and I'll kind of call on you guys, and then we may be at time. But Caitlin, over to you. I wanted to give you another chance to get in since I know it's late your time.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I think this idea around the meta level is definitely relevant to social cohesion. And another of the kind of issues with social cohesion that I didn't go into in my earlier intervention is something that I think we've all talked about quite a lot. I'm sure it's come up earlier in this conference, is the fact that the definitions that we talk about tend to come from above, from policymakers, practitioners, from English-speaking countries. They are centered on kind of European, often kind of definitions and priorities. And I think that's why with the research that, we haven't started it yet really. So a lot of what I'm saying is kind of theoretical. It's not necessarily based on any evidence that we've generated, but it is based on a lot of reading around this subject from other people's research. The research that we want to do is going to be trying to get away from this kind of high level academic policy oriented perspectives and trying to recenter definitions of social cohesion based on people who are affected by displacement. So that's hosts and communities. One of the issues with that is translating social cohesion. How do you go about doing that? And there's a big section on that in the think piece that we wrote, but also trying to get a sense of which aspects of social cohesion matter to people who are affected by displacement. Do they even care about it at all? And if they do care about it, why? What is the kind of the longer term goal? we've got 4 minutes left, so I don't want to take up any more time than I have to. But yeah, those are some of the reflections that we've been thinking about anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Claudine, maybe over to you to kind of questions on kind of operationalizing policy impact from your work, or any other concluding thoughts that you would like to share.
Sure. Two thoughts. First, when I started my work about 8 or 9 years ago, I went to young second generation and I asked them, what does it mean to be part of your community? Like, how do you understand knowing that you are second generation born in a host country? And a lot of them, the answer was that being part of a second generation meant immigration. And I think that is kind of tied to the first question on how do you kind of implement or understand all this. Our immigration system here in the US and in Europe is not perfect. It's been extremely harmful. The different ways of the rhetoric around it, the different policies are put together have in some ways led to a lot of the backlash in the diaspora community, which leads to that creation of a national identity and what being part of a national group's mean. And that has led to a lot of them having allegiance to a different country that the country they're born into. So a lot of the policy we've been putting together as a way to secure our borders, create this sense of like cohesion within a host country, has led in a lot of ways to some of those destructive, harmful dynamics I've been seeing in our different communities I've been interacting with. And this goes back also to the idea of like transnational repression, which is a really big thing right now, especially if you look at the Pegasus software and all the other not so positive, life-threatening intervention that's been happening. So there is a direct correlation between how we've been treating the immigrants, the refugees, the migrant coming into our country, with then what the sense of national identity they have, but also how in a lot of ways they have pledged allegiance to different countries. And a lot of them are willing to engage in radical behavior because of that feeling of not being accepted or welcomed in the country they live in. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. I've heard, Salma, you're still around even though you've been off camera. I'd like to, I know you have a hard stop right at the 1:15, but any parting thoughts you'd like to share, especially on kind of uptake and operationalization of some of the research and ideas that you've shared?
Yeah, so on so one just very specific thing, and I have a little guest with me here.
Hi.
One very specific
Awesome.
thing on operationalization. So we know that exposure to outgroups, specifically exposure to, immigrants or refugees, just physically being in the same space is bad. It's almost always bad, okay? You have to give people a way to meaningfully interact and have a friendship potential, and structure these interactions in some way. And don't expect exposure to translate into that contact without some structuring. So my really concrete advice is all these agencies that have these programs that have nothing to do with social cohesion, just your regular education, vocation, livelihood programming, whatever it is, if you're able to mix different groups, if you're able to do that in, your program that you're running and be really deliberate about facilitating those interactions against the backdrop of some other program that you're running, do that. That's like really low hanging fruit. If you have diverse beneficiaries, be really deliberate about getting them together for these programs that have nothing to do with social cohesion, which I think can have a really big impact on social cohesion.
That's great recommendation. And thank you for introducing the next generation of social cohesion researchers to this convening. Yulia, maybe back over to you. Same general question of kind of thinking about these, giving this practical upshot on drawing on these lessons for all of the research you're conducting and gathering through the Social Cohesion Hub.
Yeah, I had 2 points. The first one was addressed by Salma, so thanks Salma for that. And my second point refers to multi-level governance, which is a concept that used to be very popular 10 years back, or 90s until 10 years back, and is not anymore. And we have been taking that very serious in our research. And I didn't talk about that before, but what what we do is what we call accompanying impact measurement. So we accompany projects from project design to impact measurement from start to the end. And what we try to convey in these projects is that it's really useful to go from the local to regional to national level when designing the projects, and link these up in order to get a scaling up effect of social cohesion. And that has been working to some extent, and it has been working for research and for projects. So multi-level governance systems and taking that into account is really important for scaling up. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Well, Mareike, you put the operational buzzword into my mouth, and I've just run with it for the last segment here. But any other kind of thoughts from you on kind of cashing out that idea and some of these kind of practical lessons and implications from some of what you've discussed or what you've heard on this panel and throughout the day?
Yeah, maybe just one sentence really. So I would say a first step to operationalizing is, particularly for people who live in the evidence-based policy and practice space, is to never forget to take a step back and go, why do I believe this particular piece of evidence? What underpins my own mental model of how I think these things work? Because of course, our underpinning beliefs, like underpinning beliefs of people who are targets of programs, informs what information we take on board. And that is a really, really crucial thing to always keep in mind and to question our own assumptions of causality.
Awesome, thank you. And bringing it back to this room, Ali, I'd love to hear kind of any parting thoughts you have, especially on this evidence to practice. And that's kind of where we started, right? You were sharing some exciting ways in which you're bringing data and analytics right into the program cycle. But I'd love to hear just any concluding thoughts that you have on that front.
Yeah, so honestly, I mean, I've been in listening mode here since it's got back online, and there's some really deep insights coming out of this panel, and I'm not just saying that, because of what we're really trying to grapple with right now in the bank, and particularly in our practice. We have a new concept with a not very catchy title, but called process legitimacy, which is looking at the policy arena in our client countries and understanding that effective development outcomes are contingent on the process being perceived as just, transparent, and fair. And what Mareike was saying is quite insightful, because what that will mean in different societies is going to be very different. And so we're in a rethink also of our global citizen engagement agenda. That's one of the things I cover. And there we're also trying to think good citizen engagement isn't just about having good consultation mechanisms in bank projects. And we've been driven to focus on that because, thoughtfully last president said we need to have 100% beneficiary engagement in all our projects, and that sort of started to move the needle. But we need to move to this kind of systemic approach, and this whole notion of the vertical integration and what the state and society relations mean in development context. And going back to some of the stuff Salma was noting, you can use development programs to lever things that are beyond development. And we haven't been doing that systemically, and we haven't had the evidence base to do that systemically. So that's the real step change we're gearing towards. And for all of you, it's actually a very opportune time to share and influence the bank on these things. I don't know if you know, but the bank is undergoing a evolution roadmap and rethinking a lot of these base assumptions. So it's a real time to influence the MDB community on how we approach these things. So a lot of great food for thought here. I'm going to take it away. I may be in touch with a few of you actually, because I'm quite interested in some of this research, but very glad to be invited here, and great, seat of the pants moderation there, my friend.
Thank you. Yeah, you were my co-pilot here. So I don't know if you guys heard it, but there was one moment in the midst of tech chaos where Ali leaned over and said, let's just keep doing our fireside chat. And that was very helpful. But I am going to call it here. We have a number of our panelists are connected from the other side of the Atlantic. It's getting very late for all of you, but really thank all of you for hanging on through the tech difficulties, for making it back. For all the audience members, there was some substantial attrition, but the other 15 of you or so who made it back, thank you. And so thanks for all of you in the room for having our Q&A in the middle. It was a weird sandwich of a Q&A discussion, but it was, I think, really rich. And my notes are littered just with like phrases just scattered throughout both sides. And I think there was just a lot of really rich insights. And like Ali said, I'm going to follow up with a lot of you because I think this is in some ways the start of a conversation of how we would start to build this evidence base. I'm going to foster this next generation of research to action. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the concluding panel. There'll probably be a little minute. There's not another break necessarily, but there will probably be a little turnover while my colleagues make their way up. But thanks so much to Ali, to all of our panelists. Round of applause for everyone for enduring the tech fiascos. Thanks again for Donovan and for everyone. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
In some ways, it was so freeing because, I was thrust into this facilitation last minute anyway, and I was like stressed, and I was like, well, you took a curveball. I was like, this is great. Now there are no expectations. The bar is so low.
Facilitator of the year.
I was